My involvement in the Pacific began really when I was about 6 years old. I got to fulfill this lifelong ambition. It began the night after the Emmys. In March of 2003, I got a call from Tom Hanks's office that he and Steven wanted to sit down with me and try and break the back of this story, which is difficult because the Pacific campaign was so vast. And we went into Spielberg's office, and he had two mandates to me. One was I wanted as epic as possible from the beginning of the war to the end, and yet I wanted to be more psychologically astute and intense and personal than Band was. And that seems like a pretty tall order. But in fact, that's the definition of an epic, is a big canvas with a very clear psychological journey through that canvas. His other mandate was no blinking. We're going to show it as raw and as brutal as it was. And so I said, great. So that's how I got involved, and that was 7 years ago. Very early in the research process, Hugh Ambrose and I would talk 25,000 times a day about these guys and what to do. And then I found two books that informed me deeply. One was Helmet for My Pillow by Robert Leckie, who was a Marine in the 1st Marine Division, and the other was With the Old Breed by Eugene Sledge, also in the 1st Marine Division, but he served in the last half of the war. With the Old Breed is probably the finest combat memoirs ever written. And Eugene Sledge was just the raw guts, this is what happened without any artifice. And sort of the story of the Norman Rockwell kid who wore a coonskin cap, who by the end of the war was a stone-cold killer. Why repeat the most repeated genre in cinema history, you know, sort of the Second World War? And two reasons. Number one, the technology in Hollywood was not able to replicate combat with any degree of accuracy until Steven Spielberg did it in Saving Private Ryan. And he created a lexicon, a language of film in that movie that made it much more visceral and for the viewer, so that the viewer would feel a psychological affinity for the subject matter. Until Steven Spielberg and until special effects, you couldn't really create pity and terror in your audience to the extent that it deserved, the subject matter deserved. Secondly, even Band of Brothers blinked in some ways about what the men went through. And the Men of Easy Company was a darker experience than we were willing to go to in Band of Brothers. And part of the reason is they were all alive. And the Pacific was so grim as a subject matter. The battle was so much worse in terms of the actual savagery of the combat, that we had permission, so to speak, from ourselves to really go much deeper into what the experience was like, particularly because our three main characters are dead, you know, and their memoirs are so honest and searing about what they did. And so we felt very strongly that we had an opportunity to show the face of war in a way that had never been done before. One of the things that I'm proudest of about structuring this miniseries and then overseeing it and writing it, overseeing the writers and the directors, are the 3 episodes that we spend on Peleliu. Peleliu is a forgotten battle of the Second World War, a forgotten battle in the Pacific. It was 1944, a part of the stepping stone towards Japan. The death rates were the same as a percentage of who served there as Iwo Jima. It was a slaughterhouse of epic proportions. 3,000 Marines died there in about 30 days, and 10,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors died there, and you know, half as many invaded, so the death rates are the same as Iwo Jima, as I said. And it was the first time that the Americans had to experience the savagery of the Japanese refusal to surrender. 10,000 Japanese died, 7 surrendered. The last Japanese to surrender on Peleliu did so in 1947, 3 years after the battle. And so the savagery of it is exemplar. It's a perfect way to encapsulate what happened in the Pacific in a contained battle. It's not about the tactics, it's not about the strategy, it's not like D-Day. It's simply a moral exploration of what men go through in this kind of close quarter fighting. On the Pacific, I was not only the lead writer, not only a co-executive producer, but also sort of the showrunner, morally in charge of making sure the vision was kept as pure as possible throughout every stage of production. And what that means specifically is I structured the entire series. I picked all the characters. I worked with the writing staff, oversaw them. And then when we went into production, I spent 10 months in Australia on the set, making sure that the written vision was executed. And that's a very difficult thing to do. When you make a movie like this, especially something as large as the Pacific, one of the things I did as a co-executive producer was to give the speech before the beginning of principal photography for both film units. And my speech was, this is not a job. This has not been a job for me. This is a calling. And this is a story that needs to be told. And it's not just an American story. And the Australian film crew, to a man, to a woman, had some connection to the war. Their grandfathers served or died. Their grandmothers were married to, they served in the WACs. And they responded in kind. They felt like this was something that was not just a project to put on their resume. And it's reflected in the show. The quality of the show is a huge part of it was the emotional commitment of the crew, the actors, the directors, everybody to getting it right. And the Australian crews were just fantastic. One of my favorite memories of the Pacific was being in Tom Hanks's office, sitting in a chair just like this, and next to me is Tom Hanks, and over here is Steven Spielberg in a rolling chair with his own video camera. And there are the actors auditioning, and Spielberg is tracking around with his own camera, and don't look at the camera, that reminded me of Coppola and Apocalypse Now, And the actors just going, oh, that's Steven Spielberg, And it was great, and to have an input into it and to talk about it, and I think our cast is fantastic. We had a fantastic casting director, Meg Lieberman, and she casted Band as well, which is, a great casting job. And Band is a story of comradeship and shared values and heroism. And it's a little bit of a paean to the sacrifice of Grandpa, and there's a little bit of a, gauze around the lens kind of feel to it. There's a little bit of hagiography to it, which is fine. The Pacific is much more searing, more honest, it's grimmer, it is darker, it's more psychologically intense. And its theme is different. And so the scripts diverged very, very quickly. And as one of my colleagues said, Graham Yost, the Pacific is Band of Brothers, goes to hell. My advice to young people who say they want to go to Hollywood and be a screenwriter is, you better have something to say. Mm-hmm. If you don't have something to say, you're not going to be, A, successful, and B, you won't be a decent writer. There is no better crucible for drama than war. Everything imaginable that can happen in the human condition happens during wartime. Because war is so rich and the stakes are so high, I think filmmakers will come back to it again and again and again.